Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here once again. For those of you who have heard me before, I hope I will not be boring you again. And for those of you who are hearing me for the first time, my name is Dean Cheng. I'm a senior advisor with the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm also with the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and the George Washington University Space Policy Institute, which is why my wife keeps telling me that I'm getting an F+ in retirement. I'm going to talk today about the issues of industrial standards, political norms, and China. So coming off of some of the earlier discussions which brought up drones and cranes and other aspects, let me suggest that from the PRC's perspective, the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, none of those things matter. Not cranes, not drones, not space. What matters is information, and why each of those elements actually is important is because they are actually conduits of information. So let's begin with how the CCP looks at the world, not all of it, but in this relevant, particularly narrow piece, which is we now live in the information age. The currency of power has shifted. In the industrial age, what mattered was stuff. How many merchant ships did you produce a year? How many I-beams did you produce a year? How many tons of bauxite did you smelt for aluminum ingots every year? In today's world, that was the industrial age. In today's world, those things still matter. The ability to generate power and build merchant ships and build ports and all of those things. But what really matters is the ability to generate information, to transmit information, to analyze information, which is still a human function despite ChatGPT, and to then exploit information, and to do all of that more rapidly and more accurately than your counterparts, whether that means you are faster than they are, or whether that's because you are throwing spanners and monkey wrenches into their information gathering and processing capacity. So within that context then, if you think about modern container ports, when a merchant ship pulls in, and these days they pull in within a 2-hour window, not sometime next week, hopefully, if not next month. All of those containers, and modern container ships can carry 250,000, 300,000 or more. All those containers are removed or shunted around by cranes that may well know exactly which container they are supposed to move. And if you know which container you're supposed to move, it's not very hard to know what is in those containers. And if you're a military logistician, that means that that could be the spare parts for a Patriot surface-to-air missile battery, or additional SM-3 standard missiles, or spare parts for an M1 tank. Imagine if that container accidentally got shipped off to Johannesburg instead of Pusan or Hamburg. From the PRC's perspective, the focus then is to, in the information age, dominate the generation, movement, exploitation of information in order to build broader comprehensive national power, meaning economic power, diplomatic power, political power, as well as military and economic power. There are a variety of ways of doing this. There is the issue of political warfare, which I'm not actually going to talk about here today, but I'm open to in questions. Here I'm going to talk about how the Chinese are trying to extend their sovereignty, their influence over international common spaces. Notice I use international common spaces. If there's anybody here from the State Department, that was on your instruction. Do not use the phrase global commons. I know there are implications, legal implications for that. And by the way, I'm not a lawyer. So if I'm seeming a little nervous up here, that's partly why. I'm surrounded by folks who are trying to be lawyers. But in the context of international common spaces, particularly in the maritime, information, and outer space domains, political warfare is one method, but another method is establishing international political norms and industrial standards. And the reason the PRC is interested in these two aspects is because they set the framework for all the subsequent discussions. Legal cases are about individual specifics. The previous speaker went through a long list of all of the various case law that generates broader legal principles. But within that, that occurs in the American context that you are innocent until proven guilty. And that is a starting, sometimes spoken, but often unspoken assumption. If I can influence that, if I can determine what the international norm is, what the industrial standard is, you're going to have your debates on the specifics on ground that I have determined. So perhaps the best and easiest way of thinking about this one is maritime, where we have the Chinese openly trying to shape how the world looks at the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is, in our Western view, international waters under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and more importantly, under broader maritime law, admiralty law, going back long before UNCLOS. So, especially with exclusive economic zones, the area that extends 200 nautical miles from the baseline, either the coastline or the continental shelf, it is international water. The EEZ is international waters through which the owning country has essentially first claim to the resources, the fish, oil, minerals. That's the Western concept. The Chinese effort is to redefine the South China Sea and presumably elsewhere, that the EEZ is in fact Chinese territorial waters through which you can transit merchant ships freely, but naval warships and aircraft should basically request permission. That's a very different context from which to then start the argumentation about what was the USNS Impeccable doing 80 miles off of Hainan? Or why is that P3 or P8 flying through the South China Sea? In the context of information space, including cyber, we see a couple of interesting approaches. One, China clearly does not believe in a free and open internet. The Great Firewall of China very clearly establishes essentially a Chinese intranet. Now, an intranet that has 1.4 billion people attached to it. But it is an internet that does not expect to have the free flow of information. And by the way, you are not supposed to have a YouTube account, a Facebook account, if you're in China. There are perfectly good Chinese companies that will provide you with the equivalent of Facebook and YouTube. And within China, that is partly the idea of quote-unquote dual circulation. They want an internal intranet, essentially, that will try out interesting experiments, interesting technologies, and then exporting to the broader global aspect. But it is also, interestingly, an effort to establish new standards. If you do want to sell into the Chinese market, you have to meet Chinese industrial standards, Chinese security standards. How many of you folks have an iPhone? Wow. Okay. When iPhone first started production in China, Apple went to the Chinese and said, "Okay, we would like you to build our iPhones here. We want to do business with you." The Chinese said, "That's great. And by the way, here is the security standard that you will use on the iPhones we make for you." And apparently, Apple looked at that and said, "This is actually not a great standard." And the Chinese said, "Do you want to make the iPhones here in China? Because this is the standard you're going to use." So here we see an interesting use of market leverage and being part of the supply chain to basically impose a less than stringent security standard onto the iPhone, which many of you now own. We see subsequently a variety of legal structure of laws enacted within China that further justifies access to data, allowing restrictions on data, and hopefully creating a context of self-censorship. This includes the National Security Law of 2015, the Cybersecurity Law of 2016, Data Security Law, Personal Information Protection Law, all of which is then used to restrict access even to open data. There's something called the China National Knowledge Interface, CNKI. If you have access to your law libraries, once upon a time you were able to access CNKI, Chinese articles. That has become ever more restricted. The interesting argument put forth by the managers of CNKI is that the data protection law and the personal information protection law restrict what information can be put on the internet and can be accessed by outsiders. And therefore, until we get a legal judgment, all of these back issues of journals, all of these articles, we can't legally post them. It's not our fault. We want to be free and open just like you are, but all of this data is no longer necessarily available to you. And that has produced some very interesting side effects for those of us who are trying to do open source research on China, because the CNKI database literally had thousands of journals, tens of thousands of articles dating back decades. You were able to do some longitudinal studies. You were definitely able to do some interesting deep dives, sourcing. You could track authors, et cetera. And now that is much more restricted. Finally, in the context of outer space, we see China gearing up in terms of space exports. They are one of the leading nations out there in terms of turnkey satellite exports. The Chinese will build a satellite, launch the satellite, design the satellite, train ground crews, build a ground facility, do the space launch. Oh, and by the way, they will insure the whole thing for one low, low price, which is generally lower than what Airbus or Boeing or United Launch Alliance or even SpaceX can do. So for a lot of countries, particularly in the less developed world, China has been a major benefactor in terms of allowing them to partake in global space capacity. As we watch a new moon race emerge, as we watch China pushing to put its own people, humans, on the moon, one of the interesting things to think about here is, again, about norms and standards. Who writes the rules for international space traffic management? Consider the following. If you fly from India to Italy, two countries that are not native English-speaking countries, what is it that the pilots are speaking from takeoff to landing? English. And the air traffic controllers all the way across? English. Why is that? Why English? And the answer is the Warsaw Convention, the International Civil Aviation Organization, but the larger point being the dominant country in air travel when the rules were being set was the United States. So if China establishes a facility on the moon, or more than one facility, if China inaugurates one trip every 3 months to the moon, and the United States has a single facility on the moon, and we send a crew up there every 6 months, or maybe once a year, or maybe every other year, what should the language of space traffic management be? English? Well, that's an optimistic view, but I think that would be a very hard sell to people to make the argument that the country that has the largest presence and the largest amount of space traffic should not be the country that sets the language determinant for most of that traffic. Why does that matter? Because again, the language of things like air traffic frames how we think about air traffic. Everybody here speaks at least one foreign language, right? Maybe 2, 3? No? We all speak English, I think, and we assume that when we go around, other people will speak English. But the interesting question is, in the future, when it comes to outer space activities, will the lingua franca, will the common language necessarily be English? And from China's perspective, the answer to that is 1, it is not yet written, and 2, we would like it to be, because that will frame everything from literally space operations to who do you think of as the dominant power in space. One of the key things, and the reason why I said political norms and industrial standards, is that one of the other pathways that the Chinese use to try and frame the problem differently is not always through governmental mechanisms. Laws and treaties are about governments, but industrial standards are most often set by companies, large numbers of companies. So, again, going back to cranes, containers. Containers have been a revolution in international business and even domestic business. You make thousands of bobblehead dolls, you load them onto a container, the container goes to Shanghai, cranes pick them up, put them onto ships, ships move them to Los Angeles, they come off, they go onto trains, which then get shipped off to the local Walmart hub, loaded onto trucks, still the same container, which then pulls up, down the street from you, they offload the bobbleheads, and now, Washington Nationals go 2024. The point here is, why are the containers in the lengths they are? The answer is because it's more efficient that way. You can do all of this. But that wasn't set by a conglomeration of countries and governments. That was shippers, ocean shipping, railway, trucks, some companies. It was not set by governments. But when China participates, and China does participate in standard-setting organizations, who shows up? Well, you have the state-owned enterprises. That's a given. Okay. But you have real Chinese companies, private companies, companies that have stockholders and all the rest. But the funny thing about it is that when the Chinese show up for sessions like this, they all come with the same talking points and the same sheet of music. Because the private companies and the state-owned enterprises, in the context of setting standards, they hashed it out internally and domestically, that dual circulation thing. And then they show up at the ISO meeting or the civil aviation meeting or what have you, with a set of talking points. The Americans, sometimes we show up, and a lot of times we don't show up at all because, well, we're the largest economy in the world. Of course, you're just going to do what we tell you. Might have worked once upon a time, less likely today. The Europeans, to their credit, they do show up. They don't always coordinate with us. And then the Japanese and South Koreans and others. The other important thing to consider here is that it's not just the suppliers, it's also the customers. And for something like the Belt and Road Initiative, you have a lot of Chinese customers who are going to say, well, I don't actually necessarily have a dog in this fight, but Beijing approached me, or maybe just, China Red Dragon Corporation, or China Great Wall Corporation, that's an actual one, and suggested that we should go along with these industrial standards. And so again, we're talking about setting and framing the context. What does all this have to do with national security? At the end of the day, a military is, one, a reflection of the society, but the military supply chain, more and more, is a tiny fraction of the broader global economy. I'm going to make up a date, 1955, 1965, I'm going to make up a number. The United States military represented over 50%. I know that to be true. It was something like 80% of global demand for microchips, maybe higher. So what DOD wanted made the difference. Today, the US military is not the world's largest consumer of microchips. Apple, Microsoft, Google, Android phones, Samsung, Chinese manufacturers, et cetera, are much larger consumers of chips. So the standards that went into the chip in that Patriot, in that Hellfire, in that Harpoon, is often commercial off the shelf. And the security standards and other things might be tested, particularly on the proprietary and highly classified stuff. But the chips that are commodities, that are the overwhelming percentage of chips in any system, have probably the same manufacturing and other tolerances that the chips that go into your car or the chips that went into your cell phone, including your iPhone. So from a national security perspective, if China succeeds in establishing the framework and the context, that will have downstream consequences. And the really scary part to think about here is that that may not be very visible. What's the old joke? A fish doesn't know it lives in water. To what extent does DOD, and by the way, not just our DOD, Japanese Ministry of Defense, the German Ministry of Defense, the Polish Ministry of Defense, to what extent do they understand the water that their supply chains live in? I always try to make sure that there's time for Q&A, so thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Hopefully I haven't kept you too much from your lunch.
Who has the first question?
In the back.
Let's go all the way in the back, and then we'll go to the.
I always enjoy your speech, but Charlie always has you do it at lunch. But in any case, what is the current language of the International Space Station?
Wow, first question out of the box, and the answer that I have to give is I'm not sure. I believe that it is English and Russian because the ISS is jointly crewed always by Americans and Russians. Depending on who you talk to, the ISS may not even be able to operate with only a Russian crew or only an American crew. But I suspect that the Russians speak some amount of English. And I know that at least some of our astronauts have gone through at least some sort of familiarization training in Star City, Cosmic Ray.
Sir, my name is Faith Collins from the Air Force Academy, and I was just wondering, how do you suppose we stress the importance or the seriousness of the threat from the PRC to private companies, such as crane companies, when a lot of the why behind that is top secret information?
So I'm going to say something which I may or may not maybe should be able to say. I hold security clearances, okay? It is fascinating to read the New York Times and see something that I had to be in a skiff in last week talked about. So my first question is, it's highly classified. Why? Does it have to be? If the answer is, well, sources and methods, okay, the fact that Xi Jinping's driver happens to be a U.S. agent, that is pure speculation. That is not actually based on anything I have read. I'm just making that up, please. I don't want to spend 20 years at Leavenworth breaking rocks. Yes, we should probably not reveal that. But knowing that the cranes, as an example, are transmitting messages back, there are ways to figure that. Let me give you a totally unclassified real-world example. Okay? The Organization of African Unity got a new headquarters built in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, courtesy of a Chinese construction company. The people who managed the budget noticed something weird, asked I think it was an Algerian, interestingly, cybersecurity company to investigate. And between the two, they basically figured out that every morning at 3 a.m., all of the computers basically woke up and squirted everything in their hard drives back to an IP address in China. That wasn't classified, as it turns out, because that was audits and all that sort of thing. So Xi Jinping's driver happened to tell me that all the cranes in Seattle are wired to squirt messages back. I'm willing to bet that if we put a word in the right ears of cyber companies and auditing companies, we could probably figure out that, hey, you know, at 4 in the morning local time, all these cranes come on board even when there's nobody working them, or at least, you know, are hooking into an IP address that they have no reason to. That is the sort of thing that your counterparts in China, your legal JAG equivalent counterparts, their job is to figure out why and how what the commander wants to do is perfectly legal. Unlike, unfortunately, many of you folks here whose first concern is, why should you not do this because that could get you in trouble? We need more mob lawyers. That sounds silly, but think about it, right? Tony Soprano comes in and he wants Bobby McIntyre's bar. And what does his consigliere do? Oh, Tony, you can't do that. That would be wrong. Okay, after his first consigliere is found floating in the Hudson, his second consigliere, or maybe his third, if they're sort of slow in the uptake, says, give me a week and I will come back with 14 reasons why you already own Bobby McIntyre's bar. That is the approach Chinese lawfare, Chinese legal warfare experts, not just in the military, do, whether they are in the CCP broadly or in the PLA. The answer to your question, I think, is how can I imaginatively use, while protecting our constitutional rights, while operating as a rule of law society, while operating as consistent with our own legal philosophy, but that doesn't, what is it? The Constitution is not a suicide pact? There are ways to go about things, might require a little imagination, and it starts with the assumption this needs to get done. It's a long answer, and I'm not sure I gave a great answer to your question, but there it is.
Let's go there and then we'll go to.
Yeah, Mr. Chang, I'll share just a little bit of background because it's relevant to my question. I'm Major General retired Brett Williams and spent most of my time as a fighter pilot for the last 5 years in cyber, finishing as the J3 at Cyber Command. One of the things that I have noticed is the information that's being revealed about China in infiltrating critical infrastructure, something we talked a lot about Russia doing for years. And so I'm wondering, what is your perspective, given your background? 10 years ago, it was all about theft of intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. I think we underestimate the threat to their theft of healthcare data, genomics, et cetera, to expand their database around all of that. And now we're seeing public discussions about, threats to critical infrastructure. And, certainly they have been practicing that in places like Taiwan and other places for quite a while. So is this an evolution of Chinese tactics, or is this you think, a measured release of information to the public to better characterize the threat from China?
I think that in terms of how the Chinese have approached this, embrace the power of and. That they have been doing both the personal data and the critical infrastructure at the same time. I mean, they are a country of 1.3 billion people. They can afford to have team 1 through 15 doing critical infrastructure and team 16 through 30 doing personal data. I also think that going back to the information age and the importance of information dominance, I always emphasize the point about them analyzing data. That is still a human function. So how does this apply here? But before we get to that, let me talk just a little bit about critical infrastructure. That same logistician's problem in terms of supply chain, in terms of where am I getting the spare parts from, is true in spades when it comes to literally moving things. Critical infrastructure is things like railway switches. How long will it take you to load tanks out of Savannah or Galveston if the trains keep going to the wrong location? And that is, I think, a very real challenge and problem. But on the human infrastructure side, two things to consider. One, between the OPM data hack, and for those who don't remember, somebody, unstated, very deliberately unstated, hacked the Office of Personnel Management and gathered data on pretty much everybody in this room over the age of, I'd say, probably about 30, 35, because it's been a few years, all of your OPM data, your SF-86, et cetera. So that means who you are, who your relatives are, who is willing to speak on your behalf. So between that data, Anthem Healthcare, I think it was Equifax credit rating, and the dating service for married people. No, I'm not kidding. just from a human intelligence perspective, what kind of data, what kind of results could I get if I simply cross-matched all of those databases? Who is in debt for medical reasons? Who has sick family members? All of that. Now, that's the old-fashioned, if this could be 1963 and John le Carré would say, oh yeah, that's an easy answer. Now let me throw in the 21st century spin on this. Artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence requires a huge amount of data. What you get from the artificial intelligence is based upon the data you plug into it. Now, China has access to all of the data of 1.3 billion people. All of their cell phones are monitored. You have social credit scores. You have all of that information. So if I am China, I can build a great AI based on that. And what do I get? I get a Chinese AI. Because the big data is shaped by the Chinese. But imagine if I could collect all of this data on a select group of Americans, specifically those in government, military, national security, more broadly, homeland security, interior agriculture. And I had all of that information about your health care and your spending habits, whether you date even though you're married. And I put that into an AI program that I have already trained with 1.3 billion people in terms of the algorithms, not the specific data. Do you think I could come up with a pretty good AI that might be able to emulate, broadly speaking, key American decision-making? And it's not going to tell me what Joe Biden or Donald Trump or any specific politician is going to do, but it could probably give me a range of the most likely American reactions if I sank a destroyer in the South China Sea. Would anyone here who works in the national security establishment be willing to pay a contractor some money to get a decent AI that could model how Chinese decision makers operated, even if it was just the broad left-right? Anybody? No? No interest? Oh, okay. I would suggest the Chinese would be very interested in that. And that is, I would submit, they are walking and chewing gum and actually juggling apples, not chainsaws, all at the same time. That they are, because it's all about information. It's about how that information, how that data is analyzed, and then what you do with it.
I think we have a question over here. Matt?
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Blake Williams. I work in the National Security Law Division of the U.S. Army. We talked a little bit about making people better aware of the threat. My question is, putting aside classification, does the U.S. government have a legal duty to warn U.S. persons and U.S. companies of cyber vulnerability or data insecurity?
Does it have an obligation? In the sense that we inform people that there are storms coming, and we inform people that your Honda's airbag could actually turn into a claymore and blow up into your chest, and so we are going to force you to do a recall. I just got a notice. I brought that up.
But that's NOAA's obligation.
NOAA is part of the U.S. government.
Transportation Safety
Right.
Administration's
Right, which is part of the U.S. government, right?
Who has the obligation?
Oh, who has the obligation? This is a law conference. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. No. So I can give you a policy answer, which you should they, as to who it is. But seriously, to your question, this is one of those fascinating things that is a very, frankly, American question. What is the authorities? I have been in various meetings, and it's like, well, the first thing we have to determine is who has the authorities, plus who is the supporting command and who is the supported command. And it's like, I'm not only not a lawyer, I'm also not a military person in the sense that I'm not I have not served. I appreciate all of you who have. That's not meant as a joke. But that is one form of thinking that is truly alien to me. That the first question that is maybe the second, but certainly not more than the third, is what is the authorities that we are operating under? So I don't actually have an answer of whether that's a Title 10 or whether that is a Title 50, or whether that is a law enforcement, I do think that somebody should take the responsibility, and maybe it means Congress actually passing a law that was mentioned earlier. Congress needs to pass laws. Maybe Congress needs to pass a law that will finally clarify that. But yes, I think that it is important that somebody in a position of authority and knowledge, and therefore clearing the ability to declassify, boy, that's a bun fight right there, would do so. But we have one other huge problem, which is the horse led to the pond. I was asked to go and speak in Des Moines to a World Affairs Council group, essentially. And afterwards, I had a person from a mid-sized company come up to me and say, you know, Mr. Chang, that was a really interesting presentation. You gave me something really to think about when I go to China next week to talk to our subsidiaries. Great. By the way, just out of curiosity, are you planning on taking your personal laptop? Yeah. Really? Well, yeah, because it's got my emails and it's got all my business stuff. And it's like, I'm glad you enjoyed my presentation. Apparently it didn't punch home. And that is the flip side problem. And this goes to the earlier question as well, which is informing and can we, that doesn't mean people will necessarily do anything, even if you do inform them. So I am going to be really optimistic here and hope that every one of you, one, has antivirus, and two, anti-malware software on your computers. Say yes. Two, that you all regularly update it, right? Because, oh, and also three, that your password is not password 123, password ABC, okay? Because when you go to any computer magazine, they will tell you the top 50 passwords are variations on password 123, QWERTY. Oh, that was really smart. QWERTY 123, that really fools them. The number of computers that don't even have antivirus or anti-malware software installed or hasn't been up, I have no idea if it's been updated. Well, then it probably hasn't been. So it's a real whole of society problem that both of you are asking. The government represents a piece of that, and it's the information push out. Now, how do you get people to actually do something about it? I don't know.
Sir. Oh. Sydney, did you have your hand up? Let's let a student ask a question first.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sydney Owens. I'm a law student at NC Central. My question is, in terms of geopolitical tech relations, is there a way to ensure safety and security for technologically underdeveloped nations without participating in data colonialism?
One, it depends on how you define neocolonialism.
I said data colonialism, kind of
Sorry?
data colonialism, how you mentioned
sorry.
earlier, the building that was built in Ethiopia by China.
Well, the good news is that eventually, well, there's good news and bad news with that story. The good news is they found out about it. The bad news was they looked at how much it would cost to tear the place down and rebuild it and who would pay for it. And the answer was, well, I guess we have to live with this. So the answer is that if you are less wealthy, you have fewer choices. And then it becomes an issue of whose colonialism do you want? And that sounds very flippant, it's not. Because at the end of the day, if you don't make it yourself, at some level, you are subject to other people's pressure. Now, are we blunt? As an American, I believe, hopefully rightly, that we have rules on what we can do even with foreign countries and governments. And the best example of that is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That at the end of the day, we have passed domestic laws that say, yes, we really, really, really want to sell Patriots and M1s and Bradleys and well, we don't make too many surface ships anymore, to other countries. But you can't bribe people to do it. And if you do, you will go to jail. Whether or not NSA, whether or not our intelligence agencies have broad restrictions like that, I'm not sure. I'd like to think that there are few restrictions out there. I can say with some confidence, I don't think the Chinese have any. And so if you are a less well-off country, the other piece of this is you can hire non-Chinese and non-American cybersecurity companies. They do exist. You can do regular audits. You can fight corruption in your own country. That is one of the hardest pieces, right? Because the Chinese exploit the reality that some people are subject to cardinal sins. And I will pay you to look the other way, or to take this thumb drive and insert it in, which bounces the air gap, et cetera. So some of it, like with American companies, is up to the local people, the local workers, the local government. And some of it is being wise in your selection of who does what, so that you don't have a Chinese company doing the audits on another Chinese company's information technology that was installed in the Chinese-built building. It's not foolproof, it's not easy, but that's probably your best 40% solution.
Thank you.
I think my strategy now is that we're going, I'm sorry about your question, but you can catch Mr. Chang afterwards. I want to make sure that we stay on schedule because I have screwed up a few times here. But let's give Mr. Chang a real